Welcome, everyone. We're just going to take a minute. We're waiting on a number of people, and we will get started shortly. Thank you for coming. We'll give it just another minute. So great to see so many friends, and hopefully make some new ones tonight. Okay, I'm going to just go ahead and get started. Thank you so much all for joining us this evening. My name is Gregory Khalil. I'm co-founder of Telos. We are a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. Our mission is to form communities of peacemakers to heal seemingly intractable conflict at home and abroad. And our main issue area historically, although we work in a variety of different places, has been America's relationship to the so-called Holy Land, Israel, Palestine. We have a lot of ground to cover tonight, and to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure we're going to be able to do everything, but we're going to give you, I think, hopefully some really wonderful insight into what is often deemed this intractable conflict halfway around the world. And we don't think it is halfway around the world, and we don't believe it's intractable. But my job tonight is to give you a bit of foundation and some fundamentals so that you can dive more deeply into this, have conversations with people you know, at least tune your ears. So if they're connected to this issue in a way that you're not, you can hear where they might be coming from better, and read and understand what's happening in the news when you hear about this conflict. So a couple quick things about what tonight will look like. We have 90 minutes in total together. Obviously, many of you won't be able to stay that whole time, so we're recording this and we'll send you a link after we're done. I've divided my aspirational presentation up into two sections. The first section is historical. So how did the Israeli-Palestinian conflict form? Why do we call it that? And who's really involved? And so we're going to look back more than a century, but this stuff is really important storytelling to understand where Israelis and Palestinians came from, how they got where they are, and as well as the broader world. I think there's some stuff that's really relevant to so many issues that so many of us care about on this call. And then we'll break for some Q&A. And the last half hour, we'll do some more contemporary exploration. We'll look at some facts on the ground and the different narratives that Israelis and Palestinians have around those. And my hope here today is not to, overwhelm you, though it will be overwhelming for some of you. It's not to oversimplify, though for many of you on this call whom I know to be experts in this issue, this will be cartoonish. We're not going to go into every detail. Instead, we're charting these broader themes. But why? The first principle of peacemaking, or practice rather, is listen to understand. And so today we want to give you a window into understanding a multiplicity of perspectives, not trying to preach at you, not trying to tell you this is the way you need to think or believe, but to give you an entry point into understanding a variety of ways that people see same set of facts and how we got there and where we're going. The last word of introduction is just about me. And I want you to know who I am and where I come from, because I have a dog in this fight. I was born in San Diego, California, not Israel, Palestine, but my father was born just outside of Bethlehem and in the West Bank, in Judea, in Palestine, and I have a huge family there. I was once a lawyer, and I worked before founding Telos. I worked advising the Palestinian leadership on peace negotiations with Israel. So I was involved in the peace process. I'm personally implicated, and I have very strong opinions about this place. My intended role, despite those biases, is to not try and convince you of what my positions are. It's more to provide an opportunity to engage a variety of different narratives. And you can judge me how well I do that or not, but I will be transparent about my biases and my conflict of interest as we go along. But I want you to know that, so as we go along, that I'm the one leading this conversation tonight. Other times it's different folks from my team. So I hope that all sounds good. And as you have questions, please send them to the host. The host will communicate them to me. Sorry, we don't have an open format as usual, but we have a really, really big audience tonight. So with that said, I'm going to share my screen, hopefully, and we're going to have some slides on Israel-Palestine 101. And I want to give you a little, again, so we're going to go through two parts: the origins of the conflict, second, current realities. We'll have questions in both. And we may skip the second part depending upon our conversation with all of you and how that's going, and postpone that to a later time. But first, part one, the origins. Where are we going in this part? We want to look at three different dates. I know this sounds like history, but it is. But promise you, I'm going to bring this to life. This is relevant for any conversation that you would have with an Israeli Palestinian if you were on a trip on the ground, or if you really want to dive into the rich literature around this place. So we're going to look at three dates around what we call the modern conflict: 1917, 1948, and 1967. These are the foundational dates that chart some key aspects of what we now often called, and some people dispute this terminology, the modern Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Why do I say modern? Because it is modern. So you'll hear it all the time. This conflict goes back thousands of years. They've been fighting for ages. Truth of the matter, Israelis and Palestinians didn't exist in the people groups as we know them thousands of years ago. What we're seeing on the ground today is really has its antecedents for a couple of centuries, but it's about a century old. And so we're going to go into these dates, and not as a historical factual matter, but to chart these different trends, how Israelis broadly and how Palestinians broadly see them. So I want to just take a step back before 1917 and look at a map of the broader Middle East. You'll see Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, all of this, but I want to focus on this area right here. Obviously, the subject of our conversation tonight, Israel, Palestine. It all fits this little tiny area in the size of the state of Delaware. But historically, what's interesting about this place is if you notice its geographic significance, this is literally at the intersection of three different continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. Jerusalem was once seen in antiquity as the center of the world. And in fact, here in the Fertile Crescent, this area right here, the Levant, is the birthplace of civilization. So we often hear, how violent and terrible a place the Middle East is. But the fact of the matter is we as humans have fought everywhere we've settled. That obviously includes right here in New York City, where I am tonight, but it also includes the Middle East. It just happens that we have a much longer historical record based on the development of civilization and the technology of writing there about 7,500 to 8,500 years ago. And so just as there's been long periods of conflict in the Middle East, so too have there been long and exquisite periods of peace. That's important to keep in mind. But when we're thinking back to 1917, who controlled this area? I want to bring up a modern map just very quickly. I'm sorry. I have not actually used this PowerPoint presentation before, so I'm winging it for all of you at this particular moment with these slides. But just before we go back into 1917, I'll just close in on that area right there. You can see modern. This is Israel right here where my cursor is, including the Syrian Golan Heights right up there, occupied under international law. This is the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank of the Jordan River. If you were going on a trip, we'd be spending a lot of time throughout Israel and throughout the West Bank. And again, this whole territory is about the size of the state of Delaware. You can drive from the very north down to the south in a day. Very, very small area. From Tel Aviv here to Jerusalem in just about 35 minutes. Now, before 1917, this map looked very different. You had the Ottoman Turkish Empire. This is modern day Turkey up here. And before this time, the Turks controlled this area. the Ottoman Turkish Empire controlled much of the Middle East. And it was one of the longest, most stable human empires in history. Now, when we talk about 1917, we're talking about two different competing stories here. We like to call it the Big Bang of the conflict. And we're going to get into that in just one second, but we call it Zionism versus Arab nationalism. So you had the Ottoman Empire here. And the Ottoman Empire, by many estimations, was waning in its power. Meanwhile, you had something else in the 19th century up here in Europe happening. You had the Industrial Revolution. You had these new empires rising, new powers rather rising, like the French and the British. And the way that we did life as human beings was rapidly transforming, from the way we built factories and industry to the way we fought each other and in fact killed each other. And a lot of these new technologies happened to be fueled by oil, which of course was here in the Middle East. Historically, this was also the famous trade routes. You know, the Silk Road stretched all the way, this is Persia, Iran, all the way from China, ended up here in Jaffa, just on the coast near what is now Tel Aviv, and opened up to the markets of Europe. All of this. So this strategically important area, these trade routes, these resources, as Europe was on the rise and on the Ottoman Empire was starting to fumble in the middle. And what you also had in Europe was something else. You had a new innovation, a new technology, if you will, this idea of European nationalism. Now, European nationalism arose primarily in the 19th century. And this idea of nationalism, we hear bantied about in the press a lot today. And it's one that I think all of us in this call intuitively get. It's like the idea that there should be a French state for the French people or an Italian state for the Italian people. This concept of nationalism, however, was a modern innovation in human governance. This didn't exist in the same way previously in human history. And so many people saw this as a positive innovation, but there were many negative externalities. What do I mean by that? So if you're in France and you're in Italy and you're anywhere in Europe and you're discussing, well, okay, we need a French state for the French people. One of the first questions that you have is who's French? Who's German? Who's Italian? And so this question of European nationalism had real import for what was happening here in the Holy Land. And we're going to pick that up in 1 second. So now, meanwhile, you had all of these new powers, the British and the French in particular, looking over to this decaying Ottoman Empire and seeing this strategic opportunity, and they wanted a piece of it. Who did you have on the ground here living in this area? Well, you had historic populations throughout the Middle East of Muslims, Christians, and Jews. This is important to note because the Middle East, unfortunately today, is decidedly not pluralistic. And so you have many of these ancient communities, particularly the Jewish communities, and more recently, many of the Christian communities, decimated, no longer present in the same way they were just over a century ago. And you also had these local folks on the ground. They weren't Turkish, they spoke Arabic. Most people here throughout Israel, Palestine, including those who were Jewish, their daily language was Arabic. They did not see themselves as Turks. The Ottoman Turks were seen as a foreign power. You had these new powers uprising in Europe who wanted to overthrow the Ottoman Turks and come into control. You had a new idea of nationalism. And so this idea of nationalism started spreading to other parts of the world, including to the Middle East. And you had this idea of Arab nationalism rise in the Middle East. Now, what do you think was happening in Europe among folks who were scared of nationalism, particularly for our story, the Jewish people? I know we're not in an interactive format right now, so I'll assume that people are answering these questions in some ways. Well, this was a very difficult place to be in if you were Jewish, regardless of your expression of Judaism, because the question of who's French, who's Jewish, whatnot, who's not, often defaulted to this age-old trope of anti-Semitism that said that, hey, you Jewish people, you're not really one of us. You have more in common with each other than you do with your nationalities. And this started to create a new rise in anti-Semitism, which was not new. And for the purposes of this call, as many of you know who are connected to Telos, the communities we do a lot of work with tend to be communities of faith, tend to be Christians. So it's important for me to note right here that a lot of the roots of anti-Semitism stretch very directly to Christian theology, to bastardized Christian theology for 2 millennia, which resulted in horrific, consistent oppression of Jewish people for literally 2,000 years. And so you saw this resurgence yet again of anti-Semitism as you saw this rise of nationalism. And you had this new Arab nationalism evolving on the ground in Israel, Palestine, and the broader Middle East. But you had a new political ideology emerging in Europe, which was a Jewish response to this new development of nationalism. And that's called Zionism. The idea that, look, if this is the way that power is governed, and we're on the receiving end of power in a very, very detrimental way, increasingly, we've got to take care of ourselves. And just as there should be a state for the French people, so the Jewish people should have their own state. And so this was the conversation that was emerging. You can see sort of on this slide, picture of Theodor Herzl, one of the founders of Zionism in Israel, but also Alfred Dreyfus. And he's on here because he was in the French military. Very quick, short story here, brought up, prominent officer, brought up on trumped up charges of treason and sent publicly on exile to Elba Island. This was in France. He was, senior in the military, public guy. Everybody knew that he was Jewish, and even at the trial, there were people chanting "Death to Jews" and all this anti-Semitic hate speech. And what happened is that many people who were skeptical about this idea of Zionism, of creating a Jewish state for the Jewish people, started to say, "Hey, wait a second. There's something happening in Europe right now. This is serious. We have to figure out how to take power into our own hands." And so this was one of the key motivating factors that legitimized and brought a lot of support, these public, and this was late 19th century, expressions of anti-Semitism, which fueled this growing movement of Zionism. Now, meanwhile, British and French, on this slide, I just need to mention 2 things, and don't worry, we have time for the other stuff. A lot of the antecedents for this are really, really important. So I'm spending more time around 1917 than I will on the other 2 dates, just in case you were anxious right now. Here you have the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916. So I wanted to jump back. So you've got this rising nationalism, this power, the Turkish Ottoman Empire potentially on the wane, the rising British and the French looking off to the Middle East. They're working with local Arabs to hopefully overthrow the Turks so they can get access to these new resources. And in fact, promising some local Arabs. You all know the story of Lawrence of Arabia, I hope. Check it out if you don't. Remarkable story, young British military officer who goes throughout the Middle East on horseback, learns all these local dialects, gets locals to work with the Brits to overthrow the Ottoman Turks in the promises of establishing their own Arab states, including here in Palestine. If you go to Jerusalem, for example, go to the American Colony Hotel. That's where Sir Lawrence of Arabia often stayed. But back to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, 1916, significant date just because Sykes, British officer, Picot, a French officer, before World War I even starts, they decide on how they're going to divvy up the broader Middle East. And in fact, if we go back to this larger map of the Middle East, like you see so many straight lines here, it goes back a bit to the Sykes-Picot Agreement in that, here these British French guys decided to create these nations where there weren't nations. And we see this today. And you think this stuff feels historical. Just one anecdote here. I'm sure we all remember ISIS, right? This horrible organization that was based in Syria. One of their first videos was actually right along here and along the Syrian-Iraq border. And what it was ripping up this barbed wire to say that this is the end of Sykes Pico. Because for so many people, regardless of whether they were sympathetic to ISIS or not, and for the record, most Arabs and most Middle Easterners were absolutely opposed and paid the brunt of the price of the cost of movements like ISIS. What it resonated deeply with is this century sort of conquest by the West of divvying these people up, drawing borders with straight lines, creating countries out of nowhere with no consultation with the local population. And so they were even appealing in a way that they knew they would be heard to the fact that many people in the Middle East feel that the last century has been one about foreign colonization and exploitation. And you may disagree with that analysis, but that's the common perception on the ground. So if you say Sykes-Picot or 1916 to almost any Middle Easterner, they'll understand what you're saying, and it has an emotional resonance. But the date that we really want to focus on here is 1917. This is where all of this really heats up. 1917, World War I, and then the Balfour Declaration. Lord Balfour was former British Prime Minister, and then at this point, he was the Foreign Secretary. And you had, remember, the Zionist movement growing in Europe, and one of the Zionist leaders, Lord Rothschild, had been petitioning Lord Balfour after the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which agreed to hand control over some of this area to the Brits after the presumably successful war, to encourage Jewish settlement to what was then called Palestine. Palestine had never been a state, but it was this area of the Ottoman Empire here. And this was sort of the British mandate here, what later became the British mandate for Palestine. Now, why this was significant is at this point, there was a Jewish minority that had lived here unbroken virtually since the birth, since the advent of Judaism, but it was about 7% of the population at this time. There were large Arab, Muslim, Christian populations. And by the way, everybody here spoke Arabic. It's a language of common daily use. Interesting footnote historically regarding Hebrew is that Hebrew was viewed as primarily a liturgical language, and it wasn't used in daily life for many centuries. But the Zionist movement actually was so motivated that they revived this ancient language that had been reserved for prayer into a modern language. So today, when you go to Israel, you meet many generations of people whose first language was in fact Hebrew. And so the Balfour Declaration was a response to this local advocacy within Britain from these Zionist leaders, most of whom were secular and not religious, and I'll get to that in just one moment. And it promised two competing things. One is to promote the development and the immigration of Jewish people to Palestine and a Jewish national home in Palestine. That was one promise. So long as, two, it did not infringe on the rights of the indigenous Arab population there. So you have these two competing promises. And it started to heat up because this idea of Zionism born in the 19th century now had the British Empire endorsing it, looking like it was going to take control of this. And meanwhile, you had the pogroms, these horrible campaigns against Jewish civilians in parts of Eastern Europe, and rising anti-Semitism that was not abating. So Zionism got a real big sort of endorsement at this moment. And you had immigration moving towards Jewish immigration. And many of the Jewish immigrants early on didn't speak Arabic. They had very different culture. They had friction with the local indigenous Jewish population. In fact, they were leaving difficult situations, fleeing, they were mistrustful, and this only grew. And you started to see, particularly in the 1920s, a lot of tension between the communities on the ground. And we'll talk about that in just one second. But what I want to do is I want to just sort of pause here and just sum up sort of this big bang, because you can see these competing nationalisms, Zionism and Arab nationalism. As the Middle East was evolving, as the world was evolving, we were on the cusp of something new. And these communities that had once interacted quite well and harmoniously together, there were some real difficulties. I don't want to minimize that, but compared to what we see today, now we're developing some fissures and there was new immigration coming in. But does that make sense? I hope that does make sense, that we're seeing this big bang of 1917, these two different nationalisms coming to head, which sparks the modern conflict, something that's not ancient, but something modern. So I'm going to just take one pause there, and then we'll go on to 1948, and we will be done with this first part of the presentation by 7:45 Eastern time to have time for questions. You can start sending those to David Karaba, the host, and I will address some of those in just a moment. So 1948, we have two other large buckets. One just caveat here, when I'm talking about these sort of large themes, there is not one Israeli or one Jewish or one Palestinian position for anything or everything, just as there isn't one American position. They're highly differentiated, and we'll talk a little bit more about this as we get more up to the modern day. This cartoonish presentation, and that's what it is to give you a sense of the broader trends that resonate with people and what people associated with. But in fact, it is much more complex than what I'm saying. That said, when you hear 1948 has huge emotional resonance as a date to many people. And despite a very similar set of facts, the emotional resonance is quite different. So for one group of people, 1948 is miraculous. It means independence. For another, it's Nakba, or catastrophe. That's the larger sort of tale here. Now, what happened between wonderful quote, by the way, this comes, we use this a lot in our Principles and Practices of Peacemaking, which we'll refer to later. This is from Niels Bohr, the Danish physicist who actually was a pioneer in quantum physics. And so this comes from science, but this applies to peacemaking. But the opposite of fact is a falsehood. But the opposite of one profound truth may well be another profound truth. And I think we see that so well at this moment in 1948. Yes, we believe in objective truth. I believe in objective fact, but it's also true that the way that we experience the world in the communities that we're born into is a part of that reality. And just because my experience and my family's experience of the same set of facts is different from another's, that absolutely does not mean that the others should be negated. These two things can be true at the same time. So we call this principle holding competing truths in tension. And that's what we'll be modeling as we go forward a little further. But between 1917 and 1948, a lot happened on the ground in Israel, Palestine, and a lot was happening in Europe. I'm going to skim through this since I know a lot of this history is familiar, but on Israel, Palestine, which may be less familiar, as the oppression against the Jewish people in Europe grew, more very broken, scared people started immigrating to Palestine. And we saw this growing tension on the ground between Jews and Arabs who no longer saw themselves as part of a shared community, or increasingly saw these fissures within these communities, which is obviously understandable. In Europe, meanwhile, we know that tensions were rising, particularly in Germany, and which gave Nazi Empire, Holocaust. I think it's important to sit there and pause for a second, because for two reasons. One, I think for most Israeli Jews, they would tell you, no, Israel was not a result of the Holocaust. It was not founded because of the Holocaust. As we know from this short presentation, Zionism predates the Holocaust and so much of this by many, many, many decades. And also this Jewish connection to what many Jews refer to as the land of Israel obviously goes back to the advent of Judaism. But that's an important thing to remember about the Holocaust and the modern state of Israel for most people from pro-Israel, quote unquote, perspective. And the second thing that I think is really important to understand here is the response to anti-Semitism, which is relevant today because anti-Semitism, again, is on the rise today. And for for many people, Jewish or not, the Holocaust feels like this inexplicable moment, this thing that for whatever reason keeps happening to the Jewish people over and over again. And we don't know why, but we know that it does. We know that for some reason that the Jewish people are scapegoated and targeted for whatever reason. And so this is important, I think, to understand. And I know I'm not the person to probably share this as somebody who's Palestinian, but this is something that many of my colleagues would communicate, who are fortunately not on this call at this moment. But this rising anti-Semitism culminated in the Holocaust, which nearly wiped out European Jewry, 1941 to 1948, no, 1945, meanwhile, in Israel-Palestine, something else started to happen. So you had the evolution of the Zionist movement. One thing I didn't mention earlier, which I should have, is that Zionism as a political movement really tended to be more secular. So the folks who endorsed Zionism did not do so primarily from a theological basis. And in fact, many rabbis early on viewed it as a heretical movement. They didn't see it as something that human beings should be advocating. God would sort of reclaim or redeem the connection of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, restore that connection. And so there were in fact many opinions regarding Zionism that saw it as heretical. But things started to evolve within Jewish circles and also within Christian circles. And within Jewish circles, for example, Avraham Kook is the first rabbi of Israel once Israel was actually formed in 1948, but he first came to Jaffa, just outside of Tel Aviv, in what's modern Tel Aviv, outside of 1906. And he started to write and started to think in a mystic way that perhaps God was at work in all of this, and that perhaps God had his hand in the Zionist movement. And his son, Tzvi Yehuda Kook, went on to be the father, basically, of what's known as modern religious Zionism, where he very much sees theological significance to this political ideology of Zionism. We don't need to go into the details here. All you need to know is that what started happening is there was this secular nationalistic ideology, which started to evolve and to gain some religious tones. And that culminated in 1948 with the establishment of Israel, with the independence of the state of Israel. So end of World War II, end of the Holocaust, international community feels this great responsibility that accelerates support for the Zionist project that we saw began with the 1917 Balfour Declaration. United Nations in 1947 establishes the partition plan, a recommendation from the General Assembly to divide the Palestinian state here into two separate states, one Jewish and one Arab. You see the Jewish state here would be in orange, and then with an internationalized place here in Jerusalem. And then the yellow areas here would be the Arab state. It was roughly 50-50. When the United Nations made this recommendation, it was viewed as historic by Zionists. Of course, I mean, what do you mean? 2 years after the last gas chamber closes, the United Nations is recommending the establishment of a Jewish state in our ancestral land. So that was seen as almost miraculous. And then meanwhile, many Arabs around the Arab world and local Palestinians, as this identity was becoming more consolidated as a Muslim and Christian identity, which it wasn't so much before, started saying, wait, what are you talking about? Like, most of the folks who are coming, who are these people coming? These are strangers. We've lived here, the Palestinian story. And I can tell you, my dad is 94 years old. So, and I have a huge family, Beit Sahur, and grew up with a lot of these elders. The way they would tell their experience before what I'm going to get to in a second is the Nakba, as the Palestinian perspective on this situation is, look, we all used to live here, Muslims, Christians, and Jews. And my family's Christian, by the way. And we all used to get along. And now these people are coming in saying from Europe, Europe The Europeans are the ones who targeted the Jews. We used to live here together harmoniously, and now you're saying that I don't have a right to my home anymore. You can give this land that's been in my family for generations, for hundreds of years, away to someone else and deprive me of my basic rights? No, this is wrong. So there was an en masse rejection at a local level among the people, as well as at a national level. And we can get more into this in the Q&A. But what we saw in 1948 is between 1947 and 1949, tensions really heat up on the ground, particularly after the partition plan. And so this was a 2-year period. 1947, you have declaration of, in November, you have the UN partition plan. Then Israel in 1948 declares independence, which is recognized 11 minutes later in a telegram from the US. So the US was very much at the foundation of this. And then you have fighting between these neighboring Arab states, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, which went and invaded this newly declared Jewish state. You have fighting which lasts until 1949, in which there's an armistice, basically a ceasefire. And you have these armistice lines that are formed, which today are known as the green lines, roughly. I know there's some folks who have technical expertise on this right now, and so it's not exactly the same, but for any casual observer, the 1949 armistice lines, the green line, the 1967 lines, they all refer to the same thing, the boundary between Israel and here the West Bank, as we'll recall, and the Gaza Strip right here. So you can see on this map, the green line, just remember that. And here's the West Bank, Jerusalem's right here. Here's the Gaza Strip. We'll go into a little bit more detail in a second. Now you get the sense right there that, wow, this was a really historic event. And not only was it historic, people started interpreting this differently. They started interpreting it, as I hinted earlier, as miraculous. This is true for some in the Jewish community who were initially resistant against Zionism. And there's some fascinating stories that I'd love to tell you about this and how that evolved and how that happened. And it was true for many in the Christian community as well. There had been prophecy related to the land of Israel and modern Protestant interpretations of the Bible going back a few hundred years, but mainly consolidated again, once again in 19th century Britain. And that prophecy called for the ingathering of the Jews as a signal that God's prophetic clock was advancing and in the quote unquote land of Israel. And so many people saw this as clear, unadulterated signal from God that he was at work and that we were in prophetic messianic times, either signaling the coming of the Messiah for the first time if you were Jewish, or the second coming of the Messiah if you're Christian. And that's where it was at this moment that a lot of different external parties really got energized around Israel. Now, one important story that we kind of skipped over, which is so significant, was the Nakba, or the catastrophe. What about the Palestinians on the ground? Who were they? What happened? They were the vast majority of the people on the ground here. They didn't have a previous state because they were living under the Ottoman Empire along with the Jewish people. They had talked to the British about Arab nationalism, declaring their independence. But these militias seeking to form a Jewish state here, there was scuffles between Jews and Arabs, but there was also terrorism. And there was depopulation of entire villages, destruction and massacres in Palestinian villages like Deir Yassin right outside of here near Jerusalem. And over the period surrounding Israel's independence from 1947 to 1949, 3/4 of the indigenous Palestinian population, Muslim and Christian, were either expelled from or fled their homes and never allowed to return, despite the United Nations' repeated calls for them to have their quote unquote right of return. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but that's the birth of the Palestinian refugee problem, the Nakba. And so and I don't want to make a strict comparison here because it's inaccurate and unfair, but in terms of like the psychological experience, just as many Jews had trouble conceiving of like explaining the Holocaust. It's this thing that happens, we know it happens, but we don't know why it happens. The Nakba was a similarly catastrophic experience from a psychological and traumatic social level for Palestinians. And 3/4 of the population was completely driven from their daily lives, never allowed to return. That's relevant today um, because um, here, for example, in Gaza, we were talking about Gaza. We're in the second half of this presentation, we're going to get to modern facts on the ground. But imagine this, your city, I'm in New York City today. Imagine in New York City, in the space of 3 months, that the population literally tripled. That's what happened in Gaza. In just the space of a few months, fleeing from Jaffa and other parts of what became Israel, you had all of these Palestinian refugees flooding into this tiny coastal area, where my grandmother's from, by the way, which is one of the most beautiful parts of the Mediterranean. It had the best seafood in my life there. There's incredible culture. This is one of the one of the oldest continuously inhabited places on earth. Gaza City is. It had one of the major libraries in antiquity, has a rich cosmopolitan history. But 1947, 1948, just right around Israel's independence, its population tripled. And those people never left. Sick, starving, homeless refugees who never got to go home, and who suddenly this population had to take care of. This was a wounding moment for Gaza, and it's still an open wound today, where more than 70% of Gaza's population today are Palestinian refugees or their descendants with homes in or claims to property within what is modern day Israel. Today, many of the refugees live in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, as I just mentioned, but most live in neighboring Arab states, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, in very difficult circumstances. In Syria and Lebanon, in the refugee camps, many refugees by law aren't even allowed to work. So they're in many industries. So they're trapped within this perpetual state of limbo. Many refugees have done remarkable things, created multinational corporations, incredible artists, writers, despite this. But the system, the way that it's been governed since 1949, without a resolution to this issue, but forcing people into these camps and denying them of agency, whether to choose to go back to their homes in Israel, Palestine, or to make their life and gain citizenship elsewhere, whatever it may be, whatever they might want. That agency has been denied, and they've been literally trapped in this limbo. And it's a complicated situation in many ways, but this is the core experience for Palestinians: completely being disenfranchised, waking up the wrong ethnicity, the wrong religion in your own home, waking up in a new place and trapped in refugee camps for decades. And for Palestinians, when you hear the idea of the Nakba as being something historic, they'll say, wait a second, this is not history. The Nakba began in 1948, but it's ongoing today. And the facts on the ground that we see today, from the forced evictions that you may have heard about in Jerusalem, or what's happening in Gaza, or the settlements, I'm not telling you to agree with this, but if you want to understand where any Palestinian is coming from, they view it through this lens of this ongoing trauma that began in 1948, of being deprived of agency, of ownership over their lives, over their properties, of any choice, of continuously being sort of walled out of their own homes and their own lives, and denied even the opportunity to tell their story. So 1948 was this fundamental moment. Here's some numbers you can look at about the refugees, but what it solidified is a couple things for our story here. You see these competing trends. The miracle for many of the establishment of Israel, and for many it was miraculous even if they don't believe in God. I mean, this was such a compelling story, particularly after the horrors befallen on so many Jewish people. 1948, I should say too, is when we really saw an end of pluralism, the beginning of the end of pluralism in the Middle East. After the establishment of the State of Israel, many of the Jewish communities were forced or fled from their homes in other Arab countries, or came to the new state of Israel. But what you saw was consolidation for international support for two states. And you also saw this excitement among key religious constituencies. This is not a religious conflict, but I think in many tellings and writings of this conflict, we overlook the motivations of many of the players in this. And one footnote there, I didn't mention about 1917. Some of you who are students of the conflict may be surprised to learn, as I was, even after, I learned this when I was working on the negotiations, in fact, that, Lord Balfour was a dispensationalist evangelical Christian. He had a stern theology about Israel, as was Sykes of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, as were leading Brits at that time, because this theology was consolidated and developed in Britain. And so this was a time when we started to see these large movements. So 1917 is that big bang. 1948, you see these two competing truths, which are both true for the peoples involved, of independence, miracle, versus Nakba, catastrophe. We're going to jump on 1967, reunification, occupation. We'll do that in 3 minutes. I'll be done in literally 3 minutes for some questions that I hear we have a couple questions. So 1967 has these two competing narratives as well, and they have really to do with Jerusalem and the territories of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, also Sinai, Golan Heights. So between 1949 armistice and 1967 wasn't a peaceful period in this time. Here you'll see that Israel, what became Israel, was not 50-50 like the partition plan. This is 78% of the land of Israel, the land of historic Palestine. We'll get back to that in the second part of the presentation. Jordan occupied, or rather its military controlled, the land and the people here in the West Bank of the Jordan River, Judea and Samaria in the Bible. And then Egypt here between 1949 and 1967 controlled or occupied the Gaza Strip right here that we just briefly spoke about. So their military was there. The people didn't have citizenship. They didn't have full civil and political rights, but these foreign armies control them. That's what occupation means. There can be legal, illegal occupations. Just in international law, I'm an international lawyer by trade. As you know, occupation just reverts to a state of facts where foreign military controls territory that isn't part of the state. Now, tensions were rising between 49 and 67, as we know. These neighboring Arab countries were unhappy with this. Meanwhile, West Bank, Judea and Samaria, what's interesting about the new state of Israel, look, this is West Bank is where you have Shiloh, the first Jewish kingdom. You have Jerusalem. You have Hebron, which is where Abraham made the first land purchase with God. These are all the biblically significant sites. But now Jordan controlled these, and for the first time in 2 millennia, no Jews were allowed in these areas. And so this was an interesting and frustrating dilemma for many for many Jews who come from an observant background, that look, they were able to establish the state of Israel, but guess what? Like, couldn't go to the places that for them were most significant. And this happened right in Jerusalem. Jerusalem for these years, 1949 to 1967, was a Berlin-like divided city. There was a wall right down the Green Line in Jerusalem going right up to the old city, where you have Al-Aqsa Mosque, but you have the Western Wall and the site of the Second Temple, and where some Jews believe the Third Temple will be rebuilt. All of these, significant sites. And so you saw this division of Jerusalem for the first time in its history. So 1967 comes around, and there are two tellings of the story. I'm not going to go into great detail here. The predominant telling is that you had all of these Arab states with their militaries amassed on tiny Israel's border, getting ready to wage yet another war with Israel. And Israel set out and did a preemptive strike to prevent these Arab states from destroying the state of Israel. The other story that you have, which is not a minority, I mean, it's not as commonly told in the West, but it's very prominent throughout the Middle East and throughout many scholarly circles, is that this preemptive strike was actually an aggressive war, seeking to get control of strategic territory in the West Bank. You look here, this area between called Kilia, which we'll look at a little bit later, and the Mediterranean Sea is just 10 kilometers wide. Strategists at this time saw this as a very, very vulnerable position for Israel from a security perspective, when ground wars were often waged. And so you see this telling of an aggressive war to capture the strategically and geographically significant territory. Whatever the telling, the result was the same, is that in just 6 days, which is a biblical reference to creation for many folks, you saw that Israel came into control of the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, Sinai Peninsula, Golan Heights, completely routing in a war that is often taught in military history as significant for many, many reasons. We can get into that later, but in just 6 days came into control of this territory. You can see what happened here in Jerusalem. Israel came into control of Jerusalem and immediately expanded, very soon expanded the municipal boundaries from 6.7 square kilometers to 72 square kilometers, including the Old City and all of this hashed area around the Old City, making Jerusalem the largest it had ever been in history. And so they proclaimed this is with the reunification of Jerusalem. And for the first time in 19 years, Jews were allowed to go back into the Old City and to the rest of the West Bank. But what you had on the reality on the ground was something for the Palestinians as well. And that was this new military occupation. Now, you had Jordanian occupation before, which was not as stringent, but you had Israel come in and start administering all these people. Unlike 1948, where you had nearly 2 years of these population flows out, the Nakba, you didn't have the big population flows. You had the Naksa, which is the little catastrophe. You did have tens of thousands of people uprooted, some for the second time. But for the most people stayed in their homes, and Israel was faced with a dilemma. What does it do with this territory? What does it do with these people? Because now you had more than 1 million people who weren't Jewish. If you're a Jewish and democratic state, rather, I know this is sensitive to talk about, but it's talked about in Israel all the time. What happens to your democracy when you give a bunch of non-Jews the right to vote? You can't maintain, or a bunch of refugees the right to return to their homes. You can't maintain a large enough Jewish majority to maintain a Jewish quote unquote democracy under any sort of estimation. And so you see the beginning of this occupation, which was military control over the land, but still this real interest in maintaining some Jewish presence there. I'm getting some messages here that I need to wrap up. Hold on one second. So significance of 1967 is threefold, and we'll get into this in the Q&A. The beginning of the military occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which we see continue, albeit in different forms today. You have new construction of Jewish-only towns. You see these blue dots here, known as settlements. These are Israeli towns, Israeli law, protected by the Israeli military, but they're outside of the state of Israel. And then you have, with the reunification of Jerusalem, again, this fusion of these political and religious narratives, where now people who weren't convinced that God was at work really were. And this was a real motivation and energy. And so what it means for today is we have the consolidation of the religious threads of the conflict and the new realities on the ground that persist today. That means ultimate control of all of the people in that territory by one sovereign, Israel, even if you have something called the Palestinian Authority, which we'll get to in the second half of the presentation. It means Israeli settlements, which you hear about negotiations a lot, and the expansion of the settlements. And it means sort of the modern nation state of Israel in its current form. So I've got some questions to answer. I'm going to take a break. 1 second. I should have brought some water with me. Oh, I have a little. So first question, did Christian Restorationism influence the British government's support of Zionism, the Balfour Declaration? I think I got to that earlier. This was a big part of it. The historical record, to my knowledge, cannot tell us just how much British elites were personally influenced by this. But what we do know certainly is that they were part of churches and movements that were part of the Restorationist movement, and also that adopted dispensationalist Christian theology. I'm not going to define that now. We have some fact sheets that we're releasing on this in the near future that will go into that later. What were the countries, regions, and respective percentages of total immigration population of Jews entering into Palestine pre-1948? This was primarily coming from Europe. You had some North Africa, and then rest of the Middle East. really gearing up around the foundation of the state of Israel. I don't have the numbers handy right now, but we can send those in a follow-up email. And I don't remember them off the top of my head, which I admittedly should. And then were the Palestinian refugees denied resettlement? I mean, this is a great question. What you need to understand about Palestinian refugees, I think I referred to some of this, and keep the questions coming. We have a few more minutes for questions. Is that and Palestinian refugees, first, they were denied their rights in a variety of ways and are today as well. So first and foremost, there wasn't a state of Palestine. So when Israel was formed, you had an Israeli state which could take care of Jewish refugees or anyone Jewish worldwide. So still Israel has its law of return today, which allows anyone who's defined as Jewish under the secular law to come and get citizenship in the state of Israel. So you have a state advocating for Jewish people. Palestinians never had that state. It's a little complicated now because Palestinians made a big diplomatic push for the state of Palestine, which is recognized by well over 100 countries in the United Nations. But for most intents and purposes, there isn't a Palestinian state that really controls anything on the ground. So Palestinian refugees are in the unique position of being both stateless and refugees. So when you're refugees, you're really vulnerable. But when you're stateless, you have no one to advocate for your rights. The United Nations stepped in pretty early, and it formed a unique organization to protect Palestinian refugees called the United Nations Works and Reliefs Agency, UNRWA. Now, UNRWA initially was supposed to be that advocate for Palestinian refugees, but it very quickly became sort of a humanitarian aid agency. So it provides schooling, housing, healthcare, still today, to millions of registered refugees, primarily in the Middle East. But there's never been this advocate for Palestinian refugees. So the Palestinian refugee experience it's different where they ended up. It's different if they stayed in Israel. There are Palestinian refugees within Israel who later became Israeli citizens near their now destroyed villages, over 418 Palestinian villages destroyed during the Nakba. And I've driven with my friends past their own villages, which you can see, but you can't revisit or reclaim. And they have Israeli citizenship. 20% of Israel's population today are Arab Israelis, Palestinian citizens of Israel, some of whom are refugees. They haven't had their refugee rights recognized, but they have Israeli citizenship and can travel freely. You have other Palestinian refugees, depending where they are. In Jordan, it's estimated, the figures are not known, but that well upwards of 2/3 of Jordan's population of its own citizens are refugees. And you have the refugee camps there. So some have citizenship, some have movement. In Lebanon, as I alluded to earlier, in Syria, it's much more complicated. So the way that the rights of Palestinian refugees are denied are multifarious. So one is the primary denial of any discussion of their meaningful rights because they don't have a political voice. The Palestinian Authority, which we'll get into later, and the PLO, which is supposedly the representative for the Palestinian refugees, has not really paid a lot of attention to Palestinian refugees because it's a politically fraught issue for a number of reasons. So I know that's probably a much longer answer than you wanted to your question. But the short answer to it is that refugees have resettled all around the world. You have huge populations of Palestinian refugees who do quite well, by the way, financially and otherwise, in other parts of the world when they are able to establish citizenship. In Latin America and Chile and Honduras, you have immigrants from Palestine as well in North America. But the denial of refugee rights goes back first to Israel, who's denied the right of return. And this has not been negotiated. It was supposed to be negotiated as part of the negotiations process. It has not been negotiated. But then secondarily to wherever the Palestinians ended up, was it in Jordan? Was it in Lebanon? Was it in Syria? Wherever it was. So some have been able to resettle. Many have been stuck in the system where they have nobody looking out for them, and they're unable to get out of this terribly vicious cycle when they don't have anyone protecting their rights and no forum to go to advocate for their rights. So that's the Palestinian refugee experience in a nutshell. I'm going to, unless there are any questions, I'm going to go on to the part 2 of this presentation, if I might. Just quick summary, part 1. Big Bang, Zionism versus Arab Nationalism, 1917, Balfour, you remember that, these two completing nationalisms. 1948, holding the two competing truths in tension, this miracle of independence versus the ongoing Nakba, the catastrophe that Palestinians say began but did not end in 1948. And then 1967, which had to do with Jerusalem and the larger quote unquote occupied territories, reunification of Jerusalem, access to all these important strategic and historically significant lands for the Jewish people versus occupation. So I hope we're all still following that. And I'm going to take a quick sip. The second section, I intend to go much quicker than the first section. So this is, the first section was to consolidate this knowledge. I know this is overwhelming. We'll follow up with a video and some guided resources like 101 level, like books, videos, things you can watch after this. So you'll get those in the coming days if you want to dive deeper into this. But I hope people are finding this helpful. If you're not, sorry, let us know, and I'll try to learn from your critiques, and we will as a team. So 3 quick dates that I want to look at. 1993, this freedom versus security paradigm. 2005, the quote unquote Gaza disengagement. Some saw it now as a vicious trick versus a deadly mistake. And this led to the situation that we see today. And then 2021 today, is this going to be perpetual conflict or a just peace? I have to say, we actually at Telos believe that all of these so-called intractable conflicts that are man-made have man-made solutions. And this conflict, just 100 years ago, it's entrenched. There's some complexity around it. Many people don't even like to call it a conflict, more a human rights issue. We can get into some of that, but we absolutely believe and see the movement that's quite positive despite the real horrors and deteriorating situation on the ground. So spoiler alert, we do believe that it is possible to get to a just peace, and even within our lifetimes on this call, despite all of the stuff that you see right now. And I also want to say, believe all of us have a role in this. So 1993, the Oslo peace process. Oslo is the capital of Norway, but it's also where this peace process began that you may have heard of. So very quickly, I want to tell 2 different narratives about security versus freedom. This is a close-up of the West Bank that we've been talking about here. Now, what Oslo did, Oslo was an agreement between the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was established 1964 to represent all Palestinians worldwide. Remember Yasser Arafat, the guy with the keffiyeh, the Palestinian headdress, often wore military fatigues. And so what you saw with the PLO was supposed to represent all Palestinians politically worldwide, especially the refugees, considering that most Palestinians don't live in Israel, Palestine anymore. The majority of 16 million Palestinians live elsewhere, and most don't have access to the territory today. Now, PLO entered into agreement with Israel called the Oslo Accords. And the Oslo Accords set the intention to create 2 states, an Israeli state alongside a Palestinian state within 6 years. This was 1993, so 1999. It was an agreement to later agree to negotiate, and decided that they were going to, with a PLO, which had engaged in terror. I'm sure many of you have seen the film Munich, plane hijackings. The PLO agreed to sort of, enter into this agreement with Israel, renounce violence, and Israel agreed to recognize the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people and work towards the establishment of a Palestinian state. I later joined these negotiations in 2004 as they were ongoing. They went way past 1999, and there's still no Palestinian state today. I'm happy to go into details on that, but what I want to do is just chart the big themes here. For many Israelis, the period from 1967 to 1993 was a really fraught one. It was insecure. Insecurity was the name of the game. There was not international recognition of Israel. And there was something in the 1980s called the Intifada, which means shaking off in Arabic, or uprising, the Palestinian resistance against Israeli occupation. Many of you on this call will remember images of young Palestinian kids throwing stones at tanks, largely nonviolent uprising against military occupation. People, foreign, military in your towns, like my dad's hometown of Beit Sahur, administering schools, taking trash, controlling every aspect of your life, taxing you, and without any representation whatsoever. And in fact, tax strike was something that Beit Sahur undertook for a few months, which provoked brutal reprisals from the Israeli military against the local population, including, again, members of my own family. But so Israel didn't have this international legitimacy that it craved still decades after its founding. It didn't have its security with its uprising and these hostile Arab neighbors. And no Arab neighbors wanted to make peace with Israel absent, the notable exception was Egypt, but absent an agreement around the Palestinians, an agreement for the Palestinian state. So what Israelis thought they would get by entering into this agreement was long-term legitimacy and security. What Palestinians wanted was their freedom. You remember the territory here of Israel, what became Israel, represents 78% of what Palestinians saw as historic Palestine. Up until this point, Palestinians had been advocating one person, one vote. They didn't want this Zionism stuff. They didn't want this, broader nationalism stuff. They wanted equality. They didn't want to give up on what they viewed as their historic homeland, all of it, where the 750,000 Palestinian refugees originated from. For them, this was like, what are you talking about? We cannot negotiate this away. So for Palestinians to agree to a two-state solution in the Oslo Accords and presumptively recognize some Israeli presence that would presumably retain a Jewish majority, that was a huge compromise for them. For Israelis, who saw what they viewed as a need for a Jewish and democratic state, the idea of Palestinians returning, or one person, one vote, when Palestinians might outnumber Jews or have equal parity to Jews, that did not seem viable. And so you had this quest for security for Israel as a Jewish democratic state. That was the mindset of most Israelis, Israeli Jews, for freedom for Palestinians, but a real heavy compromise, because again, in these territories here, for many observant Jews, this is the territory that's most significant biblically. And then for most Palestinians, 78%, what do you mean? Like, we've got to establish the Palestinian state in just 22%. But this was the historic compromise that was made, with the understanding that, look, this is the only way out of this. We've got to find a way to live together. Nobody's going to get everything that they want. So everybody's got to get something that they want, so we can start looking forward instead of being trapped in this place where nobody has full freedom, agency, security, legitimacy. So that was the origin of Oslo. But something different happened on the ground. Now you see these brown areas in the map. Oslo established these areas A, B, and C, in fact. Won't go into detail, but what you need to know is, if you get in your mind's head or look at this map, a piece of Swiss cheese, this is where the Palestinian cities are, like Jenin and Nablus and Ramallah and Bethlehem, where my family's from down here, and Hebron. These are the population areas. Just 18% of that 22% of Palestine was slated to become areas under Palestinian control, this new authority called the Palestinian Authority. So for Israelis, they said, okay, look, this is a test case for Palestinians. You'll control 80% of your population. You'll show that you're ready for statehood as we negotiate. And for Palestinians, this is our foothold into our eventual statehood, and by extension, our eventual freedom. That was sort of the rationale by at least the elites at play. But something different happened on the ground, because outside of that 18%, these cities, you had areas B and C, the lightly shaded areas and the purple areas. That's where the Israeli settlements were. And rather than shrink, those settlements started to expand. That wasn't really noticed by many Israelis, but I promise you, the Palestinians noticed it, because the settlements started to expand at their fastest rate in history at this point. From 1993, when there were just about 180,000 settlers, to 1999, when there was supposed to be a Palestinian state, and there were 2 270,000 settlers, excluding East Jerusalem, which was still part of the occupied West Bank. So what Israelis saw also was, you saw the rise of terrorism. The first suicide bombing happened after Baruch Goldstein, who's a doctor who'd immigrated to Hebron from Brooklyn, went and massacred 29 Palestinians that were praying in the Tomb of the Patriarchs, the Mosque of Abraham in Hebron, injured more than 100 others. And there were all sorts of terrorist attacks, which began. Hamas, which was founded in 1987, an Islamist movement, which was not first part of the Palestinian political scene, but quickly became part of the scene. We can talk more about that in the Q&A and later in this presentation. Hamas started suicide bombings in the 1990s as a response to the peace process. Yitzhak Rabin, remember White House lawn, Clinton, Arafat shaking hands on the White House lawn, concluding these accords. Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli leader, was then assassinated just a couple years later by an extremist Israeli who opposed any two-state compromise or giving up any of the biblical land of Israel to Palestinians, who he saw as evil and terrorists. And this is Jewish land given to God given to the Jewish people by God. So you saw these narratives emerge that the peace process, for one, was about heavy compromises for both, but security versus freedom. But the realities on the ground experienced by both Israelis and Palestinians were different. The expansion of the settlement enterprise, and then the growth of terror. So Israelis started being like, oh, is Palestinians talk peace, but then you go off and suicide bomb, blow up somebody, in a cafe. Yeah, that's real peacemaking. And Palestinians say, well, your military occupation is brutal. And then you talk about creating a Palestinian state while you keep taking as much Palestinian land and water as possible with as few Palestinians as possible. That was the Palestinian experience of Israeli strategy. Wanted the land without the people, wrong demographic. And so that goes back, and you see that in Oslo. I'm going to skip this close-up on Kalkilia, but just to focus on Jerusalem here, you see that as well. Because during the peace process, what you saw the expansion of these blue areas. These are Israeli settlements in what's East Jerusalem, technically occupied territory under international law, although President Trump recognized Jerusalem undivided as the eternal capital of Israel and moved the embassy there, and that's part of why this was so controversial. But you see these blue areas, the settlements, forming these two rings around Jerusalem, severing it from the rest of the West Bank. And then you have the green areas here, which are the Palestinian areas. What's important to note here for many Israelis is the significance of Jerusalem. It's the eternal undivided capital of Jerusalem. Idea of never having access to this is beyond absurd to most Israelis. But it's also important to note the realities on the ground for Palestinians. From Ramallah here through East Jerusalem, there's the old city right there, down to Bethlehem. This used to be one integrated economic and cultural unit. So again, to be transparent about my biases and my experience, this is Beit Sahur, where my family, extended family, lives. On the other side of the barrier that Israel is building now, and we'll talk about that in a second, are my family's lands and fields. And my dad dropped out of school in 7th grade to farm them and to grow fakus, a local variety of community cucumber, and sell them, take them on donkey back up here 7 kilometers to Old Jerusalem, where he would sell them with my grandmother in the marketplace there. Now you not only have this ring of settlements, but you have this wall. You see the red line here, wrapping around East Jerusalem and going deep inside the entire West Bank, incorporating many of these settlements into the Israeli side of the wall, but also fracturing these Palestinian communities. So now accessing Jerusalem is next to impossible for most Palestinians, and this economic unit has been fractured. And now Palestinians in East Jerusalem, as we saw most recently, feel very insecure in their homes, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But again, you see this experience from 1993 onward, where during the second Intifada, after the collapse of the peace process in 2000, you saw the rise of the second Palestinian Intifada, where you saw much more sort of terrorism and violence, suicide bombing, often perpetrated by Hamas and Islamic Jihad. And a lot of that happened right here in Jerusalem. And so again, Israelis were like, oh, you Palestinians, you talk peace, but you're killing us. You're sending your kids to destroy us. We don't believe you. And meanwhile, Palestinians in Gaza, the West Bank, were suffering on a daily basis the brutalities of occupation against their livelihoods and their bodies, and getting cut off from the center of their historic economic, cultural, spiritual life. Fast forward, because I'm behind schedule, I was a little bit ambitious. I do want to mention some things about Gaza, and I'm sure I skipped over a lot that we'll get to in some questions in just 2 minutes. 2005, Gaza. This is an important date for you. This was the so-called disengagement from the Gaza Strip. This is a disengagement from the Gaza Strip happened when Ariel Sharon, an Israeli prime minister, and for the record, I was working on the negotiating team when Ariel Sharon made this proposal advising the Palestinians. So I worked on this. This is part of my lived experience when I was working on the negotiations. Second Intifada, Ariel Sharon had said there's no Palestinian partner for peace. Yasser Arafat was holed up in the Ramallah in the administrative headquarters in surrounded by Israeli tanks in the presidential compound there. And Sharon had just declared there's no Palestinian partner for peace. Negotiations weren't happening. And he came forward and he declared something remarkable. He said, here, Gaza Strip, we want to pull out all of our settlements and all of our military bases from the Gaza Strip for nothing in exchange, just a unilateral gesture of peace. And Palestinians, you can prove yourself this time. You can make the Gaza Strip into the Singapore of the Middle East and show us that you really want peace. So that was how Gaza disengagement was presented by Israelis. Palestinians were very skeptical. Many Palestinians didn't believe it. They said, there's no way Ariel Sharon, this hawk, this advocate of settlements for his entire life, somebody, well, I won't go into all the details there, but this guy was viewed as beyond recalcitrant and beyond hawkish by Palestinians, and his record proved that. But Palestinians were like, one, it's not going to happen, and two, there's something else happening here. And in fact, what you saw with the Gaza disengagement plan, if you looked into it, that the Gaza disengagement plan also talked about the West Bank and specifically about Jerusalem. It said that at the same time as Israel was going to remove 8,000 settlers from the West Bank, it was going to consolidate its hold over the West Bank and expand the settlements in Jerusalem, particularly in the West Bank, particularly around Jerusalem. Continue building this wall, which I skipped over a little bit, and I'd love to talk about in Q&A because I worked on this and went to the International Court of Justice around this back in 2004. But back to Gaza. So why was this significant? What did Gaza look like at this point? Well, when 2004 when disengagement was proposed, Gaza Strip had 1.4 million Palestinians living in one of the most densely populated areas on the planet, particularly in these centers here, very tiny area, and 8,000 full-time Israeli settlers. 8,000 settlers controlled more than a quarter of the land, used 700% more water per person per capita in this water-starved region. They lived in seaside villas. And meanwhile, mostly these refugees, most of whom were under the age of 18 and still are today, lived a very different reality. It was a security burden for Israel. It was an economic burden, and it was a diplomatic burden and a financial burden to defend this to the world. That was sort of, some of the Palestinian analysis regarding sort of this. And so there was a cynical view, which for many Palestinians was proved to be true: continuation of the Nakba, get rid of territory that you don't want to take territory that you do, the water resources, all of the land, Jerusalem. For Israelis, this was a really big move for Israeli Jews. They're like, what are you meaning? There's no negotiation process here. You're just going to pull out and give these folks, that's going to inspire terror. We can't do this. Like, there has to be a plan for this. In fact, there was a plan negotiated between the Israelis, Palestinians and the international community, even Condoleezza Rice, former US Secretary of State, personally worked on this plan with James Wolfensohn, former head of the World Bank, UN Quartet. Lots of stuff happened there. I know I'm throwing a lot at you, but all of that is to say there was a plan, and the plan said very explicitly that Gaza would descend into political turmoil, humanitarian crisis indefinitely, unless it had access to the outside world, free movement of people and goods. We even had a four-star US general on the ground, General Dayton, to monitor these agreements regarding movement and access. But everyone from President George Bush to Tony Blair predicted the situation that you see in Gaza today if Gaza was sealed off. What happened is Ariel Sharon actually made good on his promise, both in the West Bank and in Gaza. He removed all of those permanent Jewish settlements. On live TV, this was a dramatic event, seeing Jewish people stripped from their homes. Some younger people had been born in these homes, wailing they didn't want to leave. But Gaza Strip became very quickly what many international observers have termed the world's largest open-air prison. The airspace, the ground access, the sea access totally sealed off. And that set up what you have today. There's been what many call the siege of Gaza that's ultimately under Israeli control, whereby Gaza doesn't have electricity, doesn't have potable water, has electricity for a couple hours a day, and people can't get in or out of Gaza except in very exceptional and difficult circumstances. So the story that we began back in 1948 with this influx of refugees who never left, now there are more than 2 million people there, the majority under age 18. The statistics are just absolutely devastating, and I'm way over time. So I just want to wrap up here, but with those different, first, the disturbing realities on the ground, the larger Israeli and Palestinian themes, and then just some hope, and then some time for a few questions. And I can stay on, we can stay on a little bit longer after this if there are lots of questions. So first, I want to come back to those competing narratives around the peace process, which we really saw around security versus freedom. If you look at what happened on the ground today, and we have some other webinars that are in our archives that we'll send in the link that discuss what was happening in Jerusalem and Gaza. We have some materials that we'll share with you that can go into detail around the recent news. But to understand those details, you see from an Israeli mindset, this is about security and this is about legitimacy. Like, how can you tolerate Hamas indiscriminately firing all of these rockets at your civilian centers? You can't. And so many Israelis have resigned themselves to this idea of perpetual conflict. For Palestinians, what sparked this latest escalation, there was never any calm, never any peace for Palestinians, because the expansion of settlements has continued unabated. More than 700,000 settlers in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and few people credibly talking about any possibility seriously of a two-state solution. But these forced removal of Palestinians from their homes in Jerusalem under laws that allow Jews to reclaim 1948 property, but deny that same right to Palestinians. So they see that as a continuation of the Nakba. We see this deteriorating reality on the ground. So while there's a ceasefire, rockets aren't going back and forth, it's not happening in the news. This is not the end. This is just a pause. And sadly, things are getting much worse, and vulnerable people are much more vulnerable. You also see a remarkable lack of representative and motivated leadership. Motivated, I mean, for peace. Just today, for example, there was a Palestinian dissident who was killed, not by Israelis, but beaten to death by Palestinian security forces. We don't know all the details, but it's pretty clear this was a murder by somebody who's been outspoken, arrested multiple times just for his post on Facebook. And Palestinians are enraged right now, whether it's the Fatah or the Hamas leadership. They have never had representative leadership. And so that's a real crisis right now. We saw the same crisis with Israeli leadership. And right now, the US is not willing to touch this. We can talk more about this, or we can link you to other webinars where we go more in detail about the larger geopolitical dynamics. But there's this lack of leadership. That looks really bleak. But there is a little bit of hope here, and that's the growing recognition that human rights are at the center of this conflict. We talk about ourselves as a peacemaking organization. I'd love to direct you to our principles and practices of peacemaking. This is not just for Israel-Palestine. This is more broadly for seemingly entrenched conflict around the world. I told you we were focusing on one practice here, two practices actually, which is listen to understand and hold competing truths in tension. Just because Palestinians or Israelis have a lived reality does not negate the lived reality or the fundamental rights of both. There is no future for anyone in Israel-Palestine without a good future for both Israelis and Palestinians. That's two state, one state, whatever solution you ever want to talk about. These people are not going anywhere, and they're equal human beings as individuals and collectives and have those same fundamental rights. So whatever our politics or backgrounds are, we need to focus on that. I shared some examples from my own family. Peace with justice is not my family getting our land back with, if that means, reversing the situation. And now my family is controlling people who are Jewish in their homes or denying them their fundamental rights. That's just a perpetuation of the injustice. So we need to name that. But why I mentioned the fact that now we're starting to see this tired sort of pro-Israel, anti-Israel, pro-Palestine, anti-Palestine framework is growing old, and it's been unhelpful historically. We believe we need to center both Palestinian and Israeli human rights, that we need to recognize there's a reality on the ground in which one party has power, controls the other party. That power isn't necessarily bad in and of itself, but it means that there are fundamental human rights that are being denied. And no matter, this does not excuse Hamas's rockets, for example, to take one example, or suicide bombings historically at all. These are condemnable things. But if we really want to get past this, there's no time, there's no future that we're going to get to that's good, continually denying millions of people their basic fundamental human rights. And for the most part, everybody's suffering human rights violations, but Palestinians today, the current reality, tend to suffer the brunt of them. So the hope here is that the narrative is shifting, that we actually all have influence on this call. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not half a world away. It connects right back to our kitchen tables, to our politics, to our churches and our synagogues and our mosques. And the fact that now, even if we come from perspectives that are Zionist or we come from perspectives that are anti-Zionist, we're starting to talk about a fundamental humanity that holds the humanities of all peoples ultimately, but with a razor focus to creating a reality that brings peace with justice for both, we think is a positive thing. And I've never seen anything like it in my lifetime. I have a couple questions here. And one, Israel's declared itself as a state. Why couldn't the Palestinians do the same? Well, two reasons, historically and then contemporaneously. First, historically, there wasn't a Palestinian leadership around 1947-48. So when we're talking historically, Palestinians were trying to organize, but you had a lot of farmers, you had a lot of landowners who fled the conflict. They didn't have political representatives at that point to go and declare a state, and they felt it was unjust. They were opposed to Zionism. They saw Zionism, which was usurping what they saw as huge amounts of their land and forcing these refugees as a problem. So statehood wasn't the answer for Palestinians. Statehood, it was, no, we want to return back to our homes. We want to go home. We want a one right to vote. We've lived, Jews, Christians, and Muslims together for centuries peacefully. Obviously, from the majority telling, that's different from the minority telling. Christians and Muslims had a different assessment of those centuries, but in relative harmony. So the idea of statehood took a long time for Palestinians to get some consensus to be open to it. And it was never the primary way that Palestinians defined their freedom. Palestinians weren't reacting to nationalism in the same way as the Jewish people were. So freedom was not seen as coextensive with statehood. But then later, Palestinians did declare statehood just a few years ago in the United Nations, and most countries around the world, with the notable exception of the United Nations and United States and a couple European countries, recognize Palestine as a state. The problem is that Palestine has no control over its borders. It doesn't even have control over its own territory. You have the split between the leadership in the West Bank, Fatah under Mahmoud Abbas, and Hamas in Gaza right now. So you have this very fractured Palestinian polity that does, for legal purposes within the UN and for the purposes of international law, have some standing and claim, but in many ways is curtailed. I'm getting some more questions. It is 8:30. I know people will want to jump. We'll follow up with some additional resources. For how is the U.S. involved today? Well, this is really important. So we often think of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as half a world away. We are co-authors of the conflict, and the conflict also really impacts us. We have imported this conflict into our culture, into our politics, into our community, and we've been shapers of the conflict from the very beginning. I remember US recognition just 11 minutes after David Ben-Gurion's Declaration of Independence. But the US literally gives billions of dollars, primarily to Israel, but also to the Palestinians. Aid to the Palestinians has been reinstituted after the Trump administration paused that aid under President Biden. So now we give a lot of money to the Palestinians as well. But President Obama signed a 10-year, $36 billion aid package for Israel. A lot of this goes to military weapons. The rest of the world sees this conflict very differently than we do in the US. But the reason for that comes back to a lot of this advocacy within American communities. And for Telos, we work with a lot of evangelical communities. I told you about Balfour and Sykes. A lot of this theology was imported into the United States via the Schofield Reference Bible. And it evolved in very key ways. And there's a number of different threads of Christian Zionism. But one reason why America is so quote unquote pro-Israel in a way that many of us would say is actually not in fact pro-Israel, but undermines the long-term legitimacy, longevity of Israel in any form. But one of the reasons for that is because Americans are so pro-Israel. Not everyone, but many people in American churches advocate for this. They work at a cultural level. They support the settlement, sending hundreds of millions of dollars to Israel, including to the settlements each year. They advocate on Capitol Hill. President Trump said, I moved to the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem for the quote unquote, for the evangelicals. The largest pro-Israel organization in America is Christians United for Israel, with more than what it claims to have 10 million active members. There's organizing happening in our communities. To be elected member of Congress is one issue that you have to take a position on. And so that's what, and that's not true for most foreign policy issues. So what's unusual about Israel is a foreign policy issue, but it's one of those issues, bread and butter issues, that we really organize around, like marriage equality or immigration or women's reproductive health. It's front and center, unlike almost any other foreign policy issue. So the US ultimately is part and parcel of this. What this means from a peacemaking perspective is that we're implicated, meaning that we're responsible. This is being done in our name with our tax dollars. But it also means that we have agency, that this is something that we can say, hey, wait a second, to be pro-Palestinian is not to be anti-Israeli. In fact, these are one and the same. There's no way forward without that North Star of mutual flourishing, pointing towards both Israelis and Palestinians having an opportunity to succeed. As peacemakers, we can begin to listen to understand, but we can also identify, where do we have biases? Where do we have opportunity? Where do we have agency? Whether it's within our family, whether it's within our church, where can we cast a vision that says, okay, well, maybe I don't fully understand all this history that Greg presented tonight. It's a lot. Maybe I don't even agree with a lot of the conclusions, but you know what? Israelis and Palestinians are both human beings, and we've got to stand together with both. We've got to finally put an end to the scourge of anti-Semitism. But we've also got to recognize that putting a scourge to anti-Semitism shouldn't mean denying Palestinians their fundamental human rights too. So there is a way out of this. And the US and we on this call, most of whom are from and based in the US, have a particular opportunity to help shepherd this forward. And one last footnote here. I don't see any more questions, and I'm sorry if I missed one. There is a question about some resource that details failures of Oslo, why it failed and what it meant. We'll include some links in the follow-up email for that one, because that's a complicated, nerdy answer. I'm super geeky, would love to have a conversation with whoever asked that question. But I want to end with two things here, just about where we can go with this. As as peacemakers. First is peacemaking is working. I'm almost 47 years old. I've lived with this issue my whole life. The last months were distressing to see some people again co-opt the Palestinian cause to commit horrific acts of anti-Semitism right here, block from where I am right now, even in Times Square. And so this was distressing, but at the same time, something else happened. And for the first time, as I had a lot of queries and really empathetic messages from people who were not just trying to get a political response to what was happening, but recognize that, look, okay, yeah, I care for Israel, for many of my friends who come from a different perspective, but I understand that there's something not right here, that's not right what's happening to Palestinians, and there has to be a way forward here. And there's a huge sea change. We see new activism from J Street to If Not Now to Jewish Voice for Peace among the Jewish community within America, and new paradigms for talking about this, which recognize that, hey, look, the only way forward is going to promote fundamental human rights for both, whether or not we agree on two-state solution, one state, whatever it is, but recognizing the need to center the humanity of both Israelis and Palestinians and our connection to that. We see new changes within evangelical America. Evangelicals 18 to 29, historic poll numbers just came out. I wrote an op-ed about this that we can link to, that show sea change shift in their perceptions regarding Israel. Not to a negative anti-Israel perception, but to an aspiration to want fundamental human rights for both Israelis and Palestinians if they're interested. We think this has less to do with Israel and Palestinians and more to do with a fundamental realignment of faith for many Christians that's happening right now, and that's expressing itself as a generational level. But there's incredible hope right now. And and in that, just the twist on the hope is we often feel like the world is set in stone, and that's just not true. The one constant of this bizarre reality that we have is change. The world is always changing, and the other truth is that we're all co-authors of it. And so you may really disagree with some of what I have said tonight, but at the end of the day, if we agree that we're all fundamental human and we're all created equal, that we should all have the church chance to mutually flourish, we're on the same side, and we can figure out a way to work together and have that expression for our friends in Israel, Palestine, and on other issues around the world. The last thing I want to do is just to leave with a very short poem. I didn't expect to do this, but I love this poem. It's just a few lines long. It's from the Muslim Sufi poet Hafez. And I think it really describes the duty and the opportunity of the peacemaker. He says, the fool builds cages for everyone he knows, while the sage, who has to drop her head when the moon hangs low, keeps dropping keys all night long for all the beautiful, rowdy prisoners. Let me say that one last time. The fool builds cages for everyone he knows, while the sage, who has to drop her head when the moon hangs low, keeps dropping keys all night long for all the beautiful, rowdy prisoners. What's so beautiful about those lines is they tell us a truth about the reality of the world and how it changes. We as human beings like to control each other. We want to put each other in these boxes. You're pro-Israel, you're anti-Israel, you're pro-Palestine, you're anti-Palestine, you're this, you're that. And that only enables people who want to keep their power and the way that things are. But what's beautiful about the agency that we have, even far before politics, is the power of story and humanity and connection, whether it's that connection that you have when you come on a Telos trip or you engage in some of our programming, or the connection that you develop with someone across a line of difference, that we can dismantle these cages, which not only inhibit us, but destroy the possibility of creating a new and powerful reality. The peacemaker has that key, keeps dropping those keys to take us out of these cages, to call us to better space, as has been done time and time again throughout human history. It's not inevitable. It's not easy, but it can be done. I personally believe, and I know my entire team believes that as complicated as this is, as sensitive as the issues are that we're discussing, and I'm sure I made some missteps, and many of you will have to correct me and help me grow in my journey as well. We can do this. We can start this work. We may not finish it, but I have faith that really within the next couple decades, we will see a very different reality on the ground throughout the Middle East. And despite the horror that is certain to happen today, in the coming weeks, in the coming years, there is a positive reality that is just around the corner. So we ask you to sign up for our newsletter, get involved in your programming. If you don't want to be involved in Telos, own that agency responsibility, know that the world can be a different place if we choose to exercise our responsibility. So thank you so much for all of you who showed up tonight. It was a pleasure. I'm going to get some water so my mouth starts foaming, and hopefully we'll be in touch with all of you soon. Thank you.